Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted you're all here for the first in a series of 6, not 5, but 6, I'll have more to say about that later, presentations on the overriding issue of sustainable living. My name is Tom Morgan. I'm the director of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at St. Scholastica. I'm delighted you're here to take part in this. These lectures, as you all know, are sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice at the College of St. Scholastica. We are very grateful to the Alworth family for their support in helping this become successful, and their help is significant. The lectures are also funded in part by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Evre Foundation, and by Mary C. Van Evre in memory of William Van Evre, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, Wagner-Zahn Architecture, the Royal D. Alworth Jr. Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth, the UMD Department of Global Languages and Cultures. Did I get that right? It's a new name. I think I did. And Reader Weekly of Duluth, and from numerous other private sources. I should mention also Citizens Climate Lobby, and they're also supporting this later on, and Minnesota Power and Light, right? Interfaith Power and Light is also supporting this. So we have a lot of supporters. Before we get to the main event tonight, I just want to remind you of other things that we're doing here, some of which is related to sustainability issues and some isn't. But in October 10th, not here, but a different auditorium, we're having Marion Krupker, and there's a poster for this out there. She's from Germany, and she's got something to say about the increasing numbers of nuclear weapons that the Americans through NATO is putting in her country. And she'll be speaking on Tuesday, October 10th, at the Burns Wellness Center, which is across the street in the lecture hall there. There's also another event. This is connected with sustainability, and this is on Sunday, October 22nd at 2 p.m. Harmony, that's the name of it. It's a collaborative thing, a community event to explore relationships to the earth, featuring cross-cultural discussions among community spiritual leaders, visual artistry, and music and dance performance by regional artists. That's Sunday here at 2 p.m. on October 22nd. And a part of this series, October 24th, the following Tuesday, Gwyneth Cravens will speak about nuclear power and why that should be considered. And one last thing that I might as well promote, this is early November and then I'll stop, but the Alworth Center here is also helping to support this, a concert, One Village, Many Voices, featuring Maggie Wheeler from Hollywood, and our own Sarah Thompson and Emil Hassan, and some other singers as well, including Echoes of Peace Choir. That's a fundraiser for Duluth Sister Cities International. So there's lots of things going on. If you didn't catch all that, there's flyers out there in the lobby that explain it, or there are spotlight brochures that give you more detail. If you want to be on the mailing list for the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice, pretty easy to do. Just fill out your name and contact information on the materials out in the lobby. You can be on a mailing list or an email or both, as long as you fill out your email in a way that I can read it. And that would be fine, and we'll keep you advised of upcoming events. There are several other organizations that may well be out there, including Echo Rotary, Climate Lobby, and maybe Interfaith Minnesota Power and Light, and maybe others, local organizations that are committed to sustainable living, so take a look at that. After the lecture today, I invite you all to come to Zeitgeist Cafe. You all know where that is, 222 East Superior Street. If you didn't get one of these flyers coming in, you should get one going out. It's our regular talkback sessions where we sort of process what we heard at the lecture, chat about it, and talk about where we're going from there. And this talkback session will be led by my colleague Jane Watrous, and her background and credentials are on this flyer. So I invite you to come to that. After the presentation by Mr. Revkin, of course, there will be a Q&A. You just come up to the microphones in turn, and then he will recognize you back and forth. That's how we handle that. I do ask you, especially you community people, to please defer to the students. We like to let the students ask first questions. We think that's important. That's kind of why we're all here, so I'm sure you can appreciate that. Let the students go first, but I'm sure there'll be time for you. Everybody ask their questions smartly, to the point, and Mr. Revkin promises he will answer likewise, smartly and to the point, and then we can get a lot of questions in there, I hope. On the screen behind me, we're displaying the text of tonight's lecture through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to the technology. Nevertheless, research indicates that many viewers benefit from captioning, including, but not exclusive, to those with hearing loss. A special thank you to the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this possible every year. So I thank them very much. One last thing. If you have cell phones or other devices, please turn them off so we can direct our attention to the speaker. One last person to thank. This was a last-minute thing, and perhaps at the end I'll explain to you why. A good friend of mine helped a lot with the production here. He's not here tonight, but he did help. His name is Richie Townsend, so special thanks to Richie Townsend for production help, and you'll see why later. Our speaker this evening is a senior reporter for climate and related issues at ProPublica, a nonprofit online news source that produces investigative journalism. He joined ProPublica in December after 21 years at the New York Times, most recently as a writer of the Times' .Earth environmental blog. He's also taught courses in blogging, environmental communication, and documentary film at Pace University the past 6 years. Andrew Revkin began writing on climate change in the 1980s. By the mid-2000s, he had exposed political suppression of climate findings at NASA and editing of federal climate reports by political appointees with ties to the petroleum industry. He was the first New York Times reporter to file stories and photos from the sea ice around the North Pole. Mr. Revkin has won most of the top awards in science journalism, along with a Guggenheim Fellowship, Columbia University's John Chancellor Award, and an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. Mr. Revkin is among those credited with developing the idea that humans, through growing impacts on the Earth's climate and other critical systems, have created a geological age of their own making, known increasingly as Anthropocene. He's written books on global warming, the changing Arctic, and the assault on the Amazon rainforest, as well as book chapters on science communication. Unfortunately, and this is my fault, those books will not be available tonight, but they're widely available. You can get one if you want one. Or you can wait until May, when his latest book will come out. It's called Weather, an Illustrated History, written with his wife, Lisa McKaylee, an environmental educator. And if that weren't enough, Mr. Revkin is also a performing songwriter, and for 20 years was a frequent accompanist of folk legend Pete Seeger. He's got a CD out. In fact, I have one in my pocket, right, to show you. It's called A Very Fine Line. What's more, 2 films have been made based on his work. One of them is Rock Star, starring Mark Wahlberg and Jennifer Aniston. And the other one is The Burning Season, starring Raul Julia. Mr. Revkin graduated from Brown University with a degree in biology and later received a master's degree in journalism at Columbia. He currently lives and plays music in the Hudson River Valley. He and his wife, Lisa, have 2 sons, Daniel, 27, and Jack, 19. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Andrew Revkin.
Thank you. Wow. First of all, thank you for finding me and making me part of what's a pretty extraordinary series. Not just the series this year, but the more I learned about the past year's lectures, it just seems to be a great focal point for our campus. Peace and justice are not in a bubble. They relate to many issues. Energy access. I've been in places in the world where energy access is a life or death thing, and the factors limiting that can relate to peace or injustice, and on, anywhere you look on the planet. The burning season you heard about was the invasion of the Amazon by cattle ranchers who had a different vision of what the Amazon should be than the rubber tappers who were living there. And I wrote a book about the murder of one of the activists, Chico Mendez, who was organizing around the rights of those people to the land that they had lived on for so long. So these are issues. Most of what I've written about, most of what I've learned about the environment is that environmental issues that emerge are the result of social and sometimes political issues on the ground. So let me take you on my learning curve. This talk is basically my learning journey, which is ongoing, and the provocation coming from this notion that Tom outlined of the end of the world as we knew it is very relevant too, because so much of this planet we live on right now is fundamentally transformed in ways that we can't really think of as fundamentally different than the way things were. But we have changed the planet in ways that will have this ramifications going forward for thousands of years. Carbon dioxide, you'll learn more. These are enduring changes that are underway now, and it's a pulse that's happened. It's kind of, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's get into the talk. I start with this idea of the Anthropocene, and this is an artist in England, Robin Woolston, who did this is part of a bigger installation of art she did several years ago, and I love that. That's the, in Las Vegas there's a sign like that, and she just built that sign around this idea of, hey, fabulous Anthropocene. We've mostly been in celebratory mode as a species, these last century or so. Our capacity to live better has been amazing, turning fossil fuels into air conditioning and aviation and all the things around us. So it's been kind of fabulous. But I've been writing about the prospects for a good Anthropocene, a good prospect of that we can turn things around in ways that will have lasting benefits, not just lasting turmoil. And when I did that a couple of years ago, a friend of mine, Betsy Colbert, who just wrote a book recently called The Sixth Extinction, about this pulse of extinctions that are happening on the planet. And she, on Twitter, this Australian ethicist had written, Clive Hamilton had written something very critical about this notion of a good Anthropocene. And as you can see here, she said, well, 2 words that probably shouldn't be used in the same sentence, basically, are good and Anthropocene. Very smart essay. And we ended up engaged in a pretty rich conversation, not just in social media, but Clive Hamilton and I had a recorded conversation later that showed that we actually agree on a lot of things. But this gets to a very important part of thinking about where we're at, which is that it's normal for people to perceive data or trends in very different ways. That getting comfortable with differences is part of understanding what has to happen going forward to have some reasonable prospect of a sane journey in this era of ours. Most of you would know the basics. We've been in Zoom mode. A group of scientists a few years ago put together this project called the Great Acceleration, where since 1950, essentially, everything's been going like that, whether it's land use change, land for agriculture, whether it's use of fertilizer, whether it's CO2 going into the atmosphere. All these curves have had that zoomy quality. And most things in nature don't zoom forever. A sand bank builds and builds, and then it kind of settles back and builds and builds. People don't live forever. Someone did a video a few years ago, an animation, the impossible hamster. If a hamster grew at the rate that it does in its first few weeks forever, imagine what that would look like. And there's a fun animation online. So that implicitly has this question attached. You look at these curves, and you can't look at those curves and say, well, what happens next? You know? So that's a big chunk of what I reportorially look at. And for the moment, again, so far, there's not a lot to differentiate between our behavior so far on the planet and bacteria. When you smear agar on a bacteria on a plate of agar, as I'm sure many of you did in some high school science class, bacteria just basically grow as long as there's a resource, and until their waste products hem them in those colonies you see, they just kind of go. And so are we just going to go? What's that look like? How do you mediate that? Who's the we? We'll talk more about that word we in a minute. And I've written a lot about biological change. That sound you just heard is a very strange thing. That's this Rab's fringe-limbed frog, which went extinct several years ago. It's 99% sure they don't exist anymore. And the last of them were at the Atlanta Zoo and the Atlanta Botanical Garden because they had projects going to Central America for years when this fungus had been sweeping through Central America. And it's actually a problem in many places around the world that's affecting amphibia. They were rescuing these species, trying to raise them in captivity as long as they could to see if they could reintroduce them safely once that fungus was gone. And so they recorded the sound of this, one of the last two. And the last two, by the way, were males, so they knew, and this is the end. So you're listening to an extinct, like that's a sound that just doesn't exist anymore in the wild in Central America. And it's sad. There's sadness and there's grief. There's a sense of loss when you think about the things that are gone like that. And I tweeted about it. That's our way of expressing ourselves increasingly. Will media soon need an extinction desk to go with the obituaries desk? I've written 3 pieces, well, 2 pieces that were obituaries for species. And that wasn't a reporter's responsibility before. So there's plenty to be concerned about. And that mediates how you think about the word good. There is this thing, carbon dioxide is one of the signals that's most problematic in the sense that unlike smoke coming out of a smokestack, it's a very enduring gas. Once you release it, you take a chunk of coal that was a solid thing buried in the ground and had been there for tens of millions of years. That was carbon laid down by photosynthesis and tucked away, and you put that back in circulation. It stays in circulation for thousands of years. So that's why these curves have this zoomy quality for sure. This is from 1750 through last month. And it's a record kept by they actually have a Twitter account for that carbon dioxide record. It's Keeling curve. It was named for Charles David Keeling, who was the guy who set up these meters on the top of a mountain in Hawaii to keep regular track of things. It tells you the importance of science. You don't really understand change until if you're measuring something, then you can start to understand something's changing. And all this, if you're focused on these issues, you end up feeling like this cameraman. This was at the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Treaty talks. I took this picture in the newsroom after that was a big expectations moment. President Obama had been elected. It was everyone felt like that was the year there was going to be this magical coming together of all these countries with disparate interests to finally have a treaty that would have targets and timetables and lead us forward safely into the future. And it all kind of fell apart. But I'll talk later about why it's actually the beginning of something that has been more valuable in the end. Because there was an artificiality to that sense that we could do this from the top down. And a lot of what has to happen going forward, if we get ahead of this problem, it'll more likely be coming from the bottom up, as we were talking about this earlier today. So, but acknowledging that it feels like a bummer, and what do you do with that? Where do you go from there is a really important question. I'm going to take you on the journey, starting literally at the beginning of me. Here's the last graph I'm going to show you that's got that quality. This is the graph of us. If you go to populationaction.org, and you can go there, actually, if you have a device, you can quietly go there, put in your birth date, and you can find where you are on the curve of the human zoom mode. And so when I did it, 1956, March 25th, I come in, I was number 2.7. I came in when the population was at 2.794 billion people, and now it's coming up towards 7.5 billion people just since I've in my 61 years, and that's kind of a sobering thought too. There's so many more people. How many people and how much stuff? You put those two simple questions together, that tells you a lot about environmental impacts and options. I didn't start out wanting to be a journalist. Basically, my whole life on this planet has been journalism since I was 27, and it's increasingly been on this issue. It's taken me to some amazing places. I'll talk about this later. That picture, I guess it's not a selfie if you don't take the picture, but that's like my Pope selfie. But it's like, it's not a selfie, actually. But there I am, and there he is. I was at the Vatican in 2014 at a really important meeting on sustainable humanity, and we'll talk about that later. But, I've written about the future of the Hudson River. That's me with a sturgeon, Atlantic sturgeon, which was severely endangered. It's still endangered, but they're coming back in the Hudson. So there is this restorative capacity if you stop the bleeding, before they're like that frog, and you give them some space, ecological space, you get lots of, nature has this capacity to come back. And that was me on the North Slope of Alaska in December 2003. Don't go there in December. Someone here was in the oil industry. The oil industry is there, but December on the North Slope is not where you want to be. But it's been an amazing journey. It started pretty much where the students are here now. I grew up in Rhode Island. I went to school at Brown. You heard I got a biology degree. I wanted to be a marine biologist because there was this guy named Jacques Cousteau back then, who the older people in the room might remember, he wasn't even a scientist, but he could just he stuck a camera underwater and said, ooh la la, and he hooked me completely on the idea that the oceans were spectacularly interesting. And so, but then I realized a PhD is a hard thing to get, and I just sort of started diverting a little bit away from doing journalism, and I ended up, when I graduated, I got a fellowship that allowed me to go to the middle of the Pacific Ocean and write about man's relationship to the sea. It was a real wonderful gift, this fellowship. And while I was there, and this, again, I'm not a journalist yet, there was a boat that needed crew. It was that simple. It was a sailboat going around the world, and there was a sign that said crew wanted. And growing up in Rhode Island, I'd done a lot of sailing, but never ocean sailing, and so, but I totally was into the idea, and I diverted from my original plan for this fellowship. I ended up on that boat for a year and a half, sailed from New Zealand to Europe. 15,000 miles in like 17 countries. We almost sank twice. I was at the wheel. I made the mistake one of those times, but almost is a good word. Almost is a good word. Adventure is a disaster that didn't quite happen. I can't remember who told me that. So you want to be on the adventure side of that line, okay? But for the students here, and you don't have to go to New Zealand to find that moment, but if you find yourself at a juncture where you have an opportunity that might be a little unnerving, but it's a way to get off the track, to get out of your comfort zone, I encourage you to do that little leap, because it was this trip that made me into the journalist that I've become, for better or worse. Interestingly, that picture there, that's Lake Batur in Bali. There's a volcano there that last erupted in 1963. So I was there in 1979, and it's about to erupt again. You might have seen in some of the headlines or in your Facebook feed that 100,000 people have been evacuated from that area around that volcano. These are the kinds of things I pay attention to, not just climate change. Well, volcanoes can affect climate too, as many of you will know. But it was this trip that's in the Red Sea. It's this trip that made me want to be a journalist. I'll show you. Oh, this was my first experience with plastic. The plastic trash issue and that giant swirling mix of trash in the Pacific Ocean. Well, this was 1979 on a beach in Australia. We were just collecting this stuff randomly. So way back then, these issues were already in front of me. And this particularly is when I took this picture in Djibouti, which is this little dusty Nowheresville place. Right, the Horn of Africa sticks out, Somalia is there, and then there's the Red Sea. It's right in there, and we'd crossed the Indian Ocean, we'd all gotten tired of each other, and we got to port, and I was just wandering around, and I saw this tobacco shop that had this pile of leopard skins. Those are leopard skins, and there's dozens of them. And that was before I'd really absorbed the word sustainability, but something about that said to me, that's not sustainable. And it really stuck with me. And just the fact that I wanted to take a picture of it, that was the pull that was taking me toward this idea of sharing stories about change and pointing to problems. And that's really where I began. And I got back to the real world, as you heard. I went to journalism school because, like with a PhD or anything else, there are skills that you need to learn. There are some people who just magically write great prose, but I needed to learn. I still need to learn. It's still hard. And my first story in 1983 was about, I was working as a copy editor. The editor luckily encouraged us all, the young staff, to do some writing too. And I was looking into this issue of paraquat, herbicide, very successfully used here at the time, including a lot around here, in no-till agriculture, actually supporting a very environmentally sustainable form of agriculture where you don't have to plow. You just spray the weeds, they die, you plant in that, and then your crop comes up. But it was very, very toxic, and not in a sort of DDT way. It was very toxic in the way that if you drank a tiny sip of it by accident or sprayed it in your face, you'd die. It's like that, real hardcore poison. And it turned out to be a pretty big story when I found globally there were a couple thousand people dying of this every year. And back then, it was easy to do investigative reporting, it seemed. This picture is of a guy spraying paraquat on a field with bare legs and no protective gear. This was in a catalog of the company making it. So back then, there was such an obliviousness to some of these things that just publishing that picture from their own catalog was kind of a wake-up call. And that's changing now to a certain extent. You have to dig more, which is why ProPublica exists. My first story on climate change was not about global warming. It was about nuclear winter. The mid-'80s, some of the tensions that are rising again now were a really big deal. That was the Cold War. Still, Russia and the United States were on edge. And the idea that we could burn enough cities in a nuclear war to cool the planet calamitously with smoke in the atmosphere was the calculations that risk was derived from were the same. They were using the same computer models that were already being used at that time to study climate change from global warming and greenhouse gases. So that's when I first went to a supercomputer center in Colorado and talked to the scientists I would end up talking to from then forward until now about climate change in the heating direction. A brief diversion, I brought an actual physical copy. They have these things called magazines back in the day. they were paper. You might have seen that some prominent magazines, their editors just stepped down. It's going away, this art form. But I brought this, the little digression is that this is a sign that good things can happen. Because back then, this is 1985, science magazines. How do you think science magazines made their money? Tobacco ads. Liquor on the back, not quite so bad. But I don't think every science magazine did, but the one I worked for did. And so that means things can change. Climate change, global warming, I started writing about in 1988. We had it was a record hot year here in the United States, summer that year. Europe also. The Amazon was on fire, a lot of fires. Burning space shuttle pictures were showing that. That was the year Chico Mendes was murdered in the Amazon, who I ended up writing a book about. A guy named Jim Hansen testified for the first time in a Senate hearing that, according to his calculations, the greenhouse effect was already perceptibly warming the planet. And of course, he laid out all the implications of that. It's interesting to me to think about how journalism works. So you look at these two magazine covers, and they tell you a lot about how hard it is to catch people's attention on an issue that's kind of a brewing what-if kind of issue, as opposed to an earthquake or a war or something stark and startling and in your face. These are all issues that were either putative, nuclear winter, or projecting forward, global warming. And so we simplify them. And that leads to frustration. It leads to frustrations for journalists, because I knew even then that the issues are more complicated than that. Actually, the nuclear winter story tells you a lot about how science works. Steve Schneider and Starley Thompson, two top-notch climate scientists, and Steve I got to know for another 25 years, they did more calculations on this nuclear winter concept, and they wrote a piece that came out shortly after the idea first originated, and that piece said, It'd be more like nuclear autumn. But where's your headline in nuclear autumn? Can you imagine me going into a newsroom? Hey, Scott DeGarmo, editor of Science Digest, we need to do a cover story on nuclear autumn. But science is like that. You dig in more on something. Usually an idea in science starts out very rough-edged and stark, and then it gets chewed on. The scientific process is mostly a process of about falsification, or what can be or can't be falsified leads you to the new knowledge. So it's this nibbling process. It's like throwing meat into piranhas, and whatever's left is what you actually know. So you start out with nuclear winter, and you do end up with nuclear autumn. Or with global warming, hurricanes back then. When I wrote that story, it was a very simple idea that hurricanes feed off of ocean heat. Absolutely true. Hotter oceans, stronger hurricanes. And now it turns out, as you may have known, that El Nino can have a big influence on hurricanes. So in an El Nino year, it could be really hot. But that shreds these forming storms as they're coming across from Africa and makes it much less likely that they can get to the power of what we've seen this year. Remember, this is not an El Nino year. You would never have seen what's happening this year without El Ninos. So going forward, it turns out that hurricanes are way more nuanced. It's not like simple hotter, stronger. And that can lead the public to think, oh, well, they're all arguing, therefore we don't need to think about this yet because they don't know. But that's not how it works. We can talk more about that later. Well, as I said, I wrote the book about the Amazon shortly after that. And the Amazon, being in the Amazon, was my first experience as a reporter, really being in places where poverty mattered, and also in places where life was just weird. To walk into a bar in Manaus, this pretty big city in the middle of the Amazon, and have a three-toed sloth hanging there by the TV, where they're watching soap operas on the TV, and there's this sloth, and no one's thinking like that's weird. I thought it was pretty remarkable. But in the same city, I was just walking down the street, and I passed this funeral parlor with coffins in all sizes. And growing up in Rhode Island, I never had seen anything like that. When you think about it was so normal there to have high infant mortality rates be part of what people live with. And I interviewed a woman deep in the forest, a rubber tapper's wife, who was talking to me in a very, very neutral way about, I asked her, so how big's your family? Oh, well, she said, I had 17 kids, I have 10 who are alive. But then it was like on to the next thing. It wasn't like that was something to pause and embrace that thought. And that was pretty important learning for me. And it was, I tried to convey it as much as I could in that book. And there's still plenty of places on, infant mortality rates are one of the great success stories of our time. They've been plunging almost everywhere because of many things, and it's just wonderful to see, but there's still plenty of work to be done. And I wrote my first book on global warming in 1992. It was connected to the Museum of Natural History, did an exhibition, the first time a museum did a show on global warming. And this is where this Anthropocene idea for me came forward. I wrote this passage. It was one of these sort of throwaway points. When you write a book, there's stuff there that's, I wouldn't call it padding, but it's just where you're thinking. It's not sort of new facts or new analysis. And so it's summing up a chapter on global change. I was just doing that musing thing. One of my editors calls it throat clearing. Perhaps the Earth scientists of the future will name this new post-Holocene era for its causative element for us. The Holocene being the geological term for this period, the last 11,700 years since the end of the last ice age. So now there was clear evidence at that time that the Holocene, you could make an argument that by the way geologists determine timescales, something new is happening now. That hadn't really been articulated yet, and I just did it in a passing way. So we're entering a post-Holocene era you could name for us that might someday be referred to as, say, the Anthropocene. I just throwing this out, I had no idea. Anthropo would be a more appropriate spelling. It's a geological age of our own making. And then I had this sort of moralizing sentence. The challenge now is to find a way to act that will make geologists of the future look upon this age as a remarkable time, a time in which a species began to take into account the long-term impact of its actions. And this is that moment when I'm sort of addressing that question of, can we do better than bacteria? That's another way of saying it. Can we use this? And there had been species, cyanobacteria changed the planet profoundly. There was a huge, great extinction event when this blue-green algae stuff started making oxygen. the oxygenation of our atmosphere was a calamity for the existing life forms on our planet, and great dying, kind of like what we're doing now. The difference is cyanobacteria weren't looking up going, hey, wow, we're doing something. That's the thing that's distinct about us. We have, it's Homo sapiens. We theoretically are sapient. We have this ability to recognize change and think about it and maybe do something about it. But we haven't yet demonstrably shown that the capacity to go to the next step. And I think that is how to think about the Anthropocene. It's that engagement, ownership, taking ownership. And a lot of that is not about science. And we'll talk more about that. It's about values and how much do you value the future? How much do you value the other side of the world? How much do you value other life forms, that kind of thing. I'm going to skip forward. So from there, I kind of got into this. Magazines and books are kind of, you have time to think. You can cogitate, you can ruminate, you can blather. There's fact checkers for magazines. But then I got into this newspaper thing, and it's like bang, 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 and it was the New York Times, no less, where if you make a mistake, millions of people who matter to the world know about it. So it was very unnerving, and I learned a lot of, I learned how to write faster, and just how to be stressed, how to deal with stress. And I've covered climate change there. I started there doing regional environmental reporting, the Hudson River and stuff I mentioned earlier, but I got to be the climate sort of focused reporter there pretty quickly from the negotiations in places like The Hague. One of the weirdest things I've ever done was I was in The Hague, this is in the Netherlands in 2000, a key negotiation over an aspect of this climate treaty was happening while the United States presidency was being decided in the Supreme Court. So it was happening at the same time. So the front page was like, about the Florida recounts, and then treaty talks failed to find consensus on global warming. So I was there with the American State Department team. They didn't know what government they were representing. It was between Clinton and Bush, or was it Gore or whatever, and it was really, really strange. And the North Pole and the politics and on and on. And then around 2007, leading up to 2007, when I went to the North Pole, I shot a lot of video there, which was not part of my job description as a reporter at the New York Times. But when I had this opportunity to go to the North Pole, I thought, well, if I'm going to the North Pole is hard to get to, even harder than the South Pole, even though it's much closer. But you're on sea ice floating on the ocean. It's not like the South Pole where there's a hospital and a base. But I thought, if I'm going to go there, I better come back with every form of journalism possible. So I brought a video camera and audio equipment, and I was transmitting photos by satellite phone. And it was my first time. We also did this there was a very enterprising editor, and we thought, well, I'm on the satellite phone there, and she was in the newsroom, and she said, well, let's do a reader forum. She said, let's throw some note up on the website. This is 2003. The web was not what it is now. And basically there was a note that said, Andrew Revkin, reporters at the North Pole, ask him some questions. And we did it. It was really cobbled together. She would tell me the questions on the satellite phone, and I would tell her the answers, and she would type it up and put it on the website. But it got me engaged with the idea that the journalism can be a two-way street. And of course now, journalism that will survive in this century is implicitly engaging with audiences, not just telling you what the world is like. The old model was Walter Cronkite that I grew up with, and I know there's many people here who grew up with, where we all dined on the same information every night. Every night, literally, over your comfort food, you're listening to someone say, that's the way it is. That was his sign-off. That's the way it is. Until 1982, when he retired. And, now the media landscape is very different. But that's a whole nother day's talk, so the future of media. But I really got hooked on the idea of interactivity in journalism, so I created .earth. No one ordered me to do that. It wasn't part of my job description, but a blog felt more dynamic, especially because climate change was this prismatic issue. It's not, it's an energy story, it's a biology story, it's physics, it's meteorology, it's everything. So it's not a beat, it's a broader question, and a blog allowed me to kind of examine it in that way, in a new way, and it ended up being 10 years of 2,800 pieces from 2007 until I left the Times. And when I was charting it out, there was another great editor who worked with me on that kind of shaping .earth, he kept asking me, we had a whiteboard, we sat there in a room, before we even did anything writing. He said, what is this about? Andy, what do you want this to be about? And I thought, well, these words kept popping into my head, and one of them was, this gets back to the bacteria, it's potency. We're very powerful, and we're very smart, and our smartness has given us a lot of power through technology. But the self-awareness thing was this, we're in a race between potency and self-awareness, it seemed to me. So that became like one of these big themes of the blog, and that led me to a lot of new science I hadn't really thought about before. Social science, behavioral science. I grew up thinking about science, mostly science about the external world, not about how I think about the world, myself or others, and so that was invaluable. And I started to really think about policy too, being at all those climate negotiations. You start to think, well, when do countries come together? When don't they? And it felt like it's sort of like a two-legged race. You need people who are different to somehow like step together. And then the more I looked at the world, I realized it's actually worse than that. It's harder than that. Because how many times in the last 20 minutes have I used the word we? Probably 15, 20, maybe. But as I've gotten around the world, got to know the world in several different ways, I've come to understand there is no we. We are all the same species, Homo sapiens, but our situations, our contexts, our culture, our poverty or our wealth divide us into groups that are so fundamentally different. My energy norms are somewhat similar to my sister's. I took that picture, and my sister lives in New York City in a tiny apartment. She lives a wonderfully low-carbon life. New York City, because you live so close together and you walk so much, and there's so much public transit, New Yorkers have like the best possible carbon footprint. But she also has a stove that's natural gas, and it's great. You click it and you're there. I've just finished a big project that's coming out soon for ProPublica about the challenge of cooking in other parts of the world, where the norm is like that. I've been in huts like that, and you'll see some video soon on the website about what that's like. And they have a very different interpretation of energy and all these things that we take for granted. So there's no we when it comes to energy. India has a 2 ton per person per year carbon footprint. That's how much CO2, if you divide it per person in a society, is each person responsible for. So it's 2 tons in India, and it's 17 tons here per person. And India has people who are as rich and powerful as we are. So there are pockets of high carbon India too. But when you average out 1.2 billion people there, it's 2 tons per person. So what right do we have to tell India not to use coal? That's one of those big questions going forward. No, there's no we. And I was in, 2 years ago, I had a pretty big carbon footprint as a reporter. I was in Singapore. I'm sure someone here has been there. And there's this thing called Gardens by the Bay, which is one of the most surreal places I've been. It's these giant glass enclosures with beautiful, unbelievable botanical gardens of species of plants from all around the world. And they have one that's like a Mediterranean climate and one that's a cloud forest climate. So as I was walking through there, I came out and the doors had this sort of hissing kind of hermetically sealed thing. And I realized I was in a museum of climates. Like you can go there, as long as Singapore is a prosperous place and there's energy or whatever, you can go there 50 years from now and you can experience the early 21st century Mediterranean climate. It's locked in a bubble. And over here you've got the cloud forest climate. And that was really weird to think about. And then I was in a slum in Nairobi, the bottom picture, where the energy picture and the poverty picture is so profoundly different. And they're both big cities right now. And again, that reinforced for me that on that context, there's no we. But there's another context in which there's no we, which is the behavioral sciences that I was starting to get familiar with. I started writing about that stuff in 2006, right after Al Gore's movie came out and the world negotiations on climate treaty, and we were having negotiations here over a climate bill, from there right through 2009. Didn't go anywhere. And I started thinking, what is all this polarization? What is the source of our differences? And I started talking to people who were dug in on that literature or who were doing research. And it was like, to them, it was like as if I had come off an island and didn't know basic physics or something. They were like, wait, don't you know? don't you know that? Don't you know the science that tells you that we don't think about things most of the time? That we actually filter when we think we're thinking, we're actually feeling most of the time. And there's this what's called cultural cognition is one body of science where empirical work has been done, statistically significant work that shows you that, and again, you're sort of a self-selected group, so you might have less variety than a pure chunk of Minnesota. But essentially, it's totally normal for different people to look at the same information and come away with completely different reactions. And if you've been in a debate about global warming, with anyone, whatever side you're on, you will know that new information doesn't change people. In fact, new information actually often reinforces people's silos. And the smarter you are, you would think, okay, well, if you know more about science, then you're going to know more about global warming because it's basic science, right? It doesn't work that way either. Just go to culturalandcognition.net and maybe have a beer or stronger drink. Especially as a journalist. You know, here I spent my whole career winning awards by communicating science. And then this literature was telling me that communicating climate science better isn't going to make everyone suddenly grasp this issue and act in some way that I think is right. And I tested this by, this is around 2009, I did sort of this survey of Nobel Prize winning physicists. Okay, physicists are, you know, that would be a good subsample to think about, right? And these are Nobel Prize winning physicists, so they know the basics of physical science. And essentially, at that time, and still true, you could find a Nobel Prize winning physicist. If you wanted to go into a bar and have an argument about global warming, you could find one to be there, to be your companion, your buddy by your side, helping you make your argument. And that, it sounds weird, but it's true. And I could tell you more about these guys, but I want to save time for other things. And the book that I have coming out next year has one of the chapters is on this aspect of climate science. And to me, it became clear it's actually perhaps more important to understand the behavioral science than the actual climate science, because in a way it can relax you, because it makes it normal that you would, what you think right now is being very abnormal, that why don't people get this the way I get it, is actually normal. And I'll talk to you in a few minutes about what you can do with that. It's not just disempowering, it's actually empowering information. But it's science. It's, to be in denial of that is as, to me, unproductive as to be in denial of what's a greenhouse gas. So we can talk more. And I actually think I proposed here recently, I'm really bad at Photoshop and stuff, but I thought if Al Gore did a sequel to his movie, but what do you call a third film? A trequel? I don't know. If there's a third film, it should be called An Inconvenient Mind. And this is, by the way, this doesn't just apply to climate science. Having written much about earthquake risk, you see the same pattern where the risk is clear. It's actually more clear than with climate science, and it's still disregarded. And what's that about? And until we get our head around our head and our communal head, which is social science, we might be worsening problems when they don't have to worsen. I'm just going to fast forward a little bit. There was this young policy analyst at Yale named Kelly Levin who, I guess around the same time, around 2009, 2010, she wrote a paper proposing that global warming was a super wicked problem. Economists a long time ago came up with a class of problems called wicked problems, where it's basically where you have to fix something that involves doing multiple things at once. And they're all interlinked so that there's these feedbacks that make it hard. And she called global warming super wicked. And j.mp/superwicked can take you to her paper. And Richard Lazarus wrote another paper that had this wonderful headline. This captures, I think, a really important part of this problem. Restraining the present to liberate the future. I mean, that's really the challenge of global warming. It's not about the hurricanes you see out the window today. It's about what kind of impulse do we want to leave on this climate system for generations to come. There's a whole other, we could spend an hour talking about the science of that, but it's mostly about future impacts because of that building CO2. It takes time for that signal to get into the system. And so then, you know, knowing all this stuff about us, okay, we're in surge mode, We're all strong like this rugby team. There's no we. So I don't understand scrum. Someone, do you have rugby here? If someone knows the rules, like what is a scrum? How does it work? But somehow we're not, this takes me beyond the idea of the two-legged race or three-legged race. It's a really tough problem when we're all in this tangle. And what do you do? How do you design? How do you work with that? And I've struggled with this, and I've listened to a lot of people. And the closing part of this talk will propose a way forward. And design, we think about design, it's mostly, I met some interesting people focused on engineering here earlier from the other campus. And engineers are great, and they're vital, but engineering in and of itself is not a solution. It's engineering in the interest of what? For what? One of the great revolutions of our time for energy was fracking. It's great. It got a huge amount of natural gas. It greatly increased the capacity to replace coal with natural gas, which has been the biggest thing that's taken down US emissions of carbon dioxide. But of course, it depends on how you do it. And so engineering in itself, these are some cool widgets that could play a big role, and solar is playing a growing role. Nuclear is kind of in the back seat right now because of the financial questions as much as anything else. This is this spongy material at Arizona State that sucks CO2 out of the air when it's dry, and you put it into a wet environment, and it liberates the CO2. So think about that in Arizona. If you have some kind of, conveyor belt of this stuff coming from the hot, dry outside, sucking in carbon dioxide, comes into a greenhouse, liberates it, plants take it up and become fuel or whatever, you end up with some interesting possibilities. So that stuff's great, but that's not the kind of engineering, that's not, in itself, it's insufficient. Very quickly, I heard this talk by a systems guy thinking a lot about sustainability named Heriberto Cabezas a couple of years ago. And it was mind-blowing. He has this incredibly sophisticated model integrating biogeophysical models of the world with social models and business. And, one of those, and I don't know the math behind these models is beyond me. But his conclusions were, long list, but the last one was the one that really caught my attention as he gave this talk in New York City. Coordinated manipulation of at least 6 variables is necessary to maintain stability for 200 years or so, going forward. Meaning the human enterprise. To have us get through the next couple of hundred years, you have to coordinate, you have to manipulate 6 variables in a coordinated way. And whatever those are. And I heard this in my hand, I was like a student, that like Hermione and Harry Potter, ding. And so at the end of the talk, I said to him, that doesn't feel like the world I know. Like, coordinated manipulation of 6 variables is necessary to maintain stability. How would that happen? And his answer was really interesting. He said, I quote, I wrote it down carefully, "We lack a cultural narrative that says sustainability is really important. We have a cultural narrative that says murder is wrong. We don't have a cultural narrative that says managing our planet in a way that allows us to live on it as long as we can is probably the most important thing we can do." And that was very interesting to me because he had put so much effort into creating this mechanistic model of things, but it turns out that the answer is really not about something mechanical. It's about spiritual, ethical, moral questions. And that's, it was that kind of reporting that led me increasingly to think about this way beyond the conventional sort of, number-driven way. And to think about goals. So what are our new goals? What would work if what I've laid out is true? Then where do we go with that, And I had some ideas. And I'm not saying they're the right idea. There's no we, remember? My ideas are just part of a big mix. I do think numbers are valuable. These are numbers you've heard many times if you're focused on climate change. There are other numbers for other issues. Keeping things less than 2 degrees, 80% reduction by 2050. My friend Bill McKibben and the 350 movement to try to take CO2 levels back down to where they were back in 1988. Last time that number, CO2 was at 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. That year, 1988, 30 years from next year, the year I started writing about this issue, that was the last time 350 was the number. And we're not going to get back there anytime soon because of the enduring nature of that gas. So numbers are valuable, but I think I'm not sure they take you where you need to go. Paris, Copenhagen was a failure because it was mostly about numbers. Some people there were demanding targets and timetables, just like 80 by 2050. You've got to sign up. Every country on the planet has to commit to X, Y, and Z, and there has to be some mechanism to punish, free riders and all that stuff. But that didn't capture that there's no we, that there's no way to have that happen. And so the valuable thing that happened in Paris, between Copenhagen and Paris, was the world realized a soft approach to diplomacy, having countries come in a voluntary way, feels very insufficient, but it's really the human way. There was no way you're going to get 195, 200 countries to the table for something that had like a contractual, legal aspects to it. So Paris was a great success in that sense because it's reality-based, but the weak thing there is Paris was only about between now and 2030. So this is the only really wonky thing I'm going to show you, but it's worth showing you. So that's 2020, and behind the letters there is 2030. The range in emissions, those are emissions tracks for the world. That's where we were going to agree on. Business as usual for emissions of CO2 is the high one. Various scientific assessments of what would be dangerous, or where you would need to stay to avoid high risks of dangerous climate change, is that blue band going down through 2030. And Paris was basically the yellowish, orangish area. It almost doesn't matter, just being in that zone. And so everyone is like negotiating. Well, the United States will do this, and Europe will do that. But none of this has meaning until you take it to the full century. And that's where things get back to the guy. Remember the guy in the news guy sitting there like this? Well, the next slide could do that for you. So what you see here, and I'll click back, that entire last part, that whole thing you saw on TV about Paris, that is in that box on the left. And where you have to go to have safe emissions track for the planet through this century is that blue track there. So nothing that was discussed in Paris has any relationship to that. And that's where there's been some denial, even among those who are pursuing good outcomes, I think are not really reflecting the reality of that. And when you do reflect on what would need to happen there, you have to take it another step further and think about, well, what else is happening on the planet between now and 2100? Well, Nigeria, just Nigeria, has this range of possibilities for its population in between now and the end of the century. And the mid-range number, just for Nigeria, by late in the century, is 750 million people, just in that one country in Africa. So the population still matters. Many people have kind of left that out of the equation. And there's another reason it matters, because if you have high fertility rates in places that are vulnerable to environmental hazards like sub-Saharan Africa, then you're just putting more and more people in harm's way, no matter what happens with climate change. And that makes it even a tougher challenge to think about this next thing. Well, what do you do? So new goals. The thing I think about increasingly, rather than numbers, in the context of numbers, yeah, but what would you want? What are the things you look around and say, what's lacking? Or what are the factors? What are the traits in society or in individuals, the traits in the person next to you that would give you a sense of comfort that we can head through this century and come out the other end feeling like we had a creditable path? Well, I think you can name those things. You can name, transparency, empathy, but they're not numbers. That's the thing that's powerful to me. They're capacities. And they remind me of, we were talking about our children earlier, when you have a kid, you all were children, even those who haven't had one. But when you have a kid, you're looking down at this child, and all you want to do is protect them. All you want to do is control the environment around them. And you know, because you've read all these books, that that's not what you should do. They should be free to bounce off the wall and free to find their own path, but you want them to succeed. So what are you creating around them? You want to create a zone that's sort of safe, but not top-down control. And that feels like part of the path forward. My wife used to work at a nature museum in the Hudson Valley where they created a space where the kids can basically run around, and there's not anything that's too dangerous, but it's where the kids can really be on their own. And it's kind of like, how do you create that kind of environment? Is part of, I think, where it's worth thinking about. And so again, I think on Twitter sometimes. So I started to articulate this in 2013 with a series of tweets. I'm just going to fast forward it so we have time to talk. Strategy for sustainable human progress. Well, and this is like my list of some of those things, those traits, those capacities. Bend, stretch, reach, teach. Reveal, reflect, rejoice, repeat. And then I did a tweet for each of those. And then I've written pieces since then that elaborate on what I mean by those words. I'm going to really fast forward through an outline, a sketch for an architecture for societies going forward, or for what you'd work on going forward to make, to raise odds of good outcomes. Bend is like, resilience is one of those overused words right now. And so resilience is easy, making a building that can absorb a flood. They call it safe to fail design as opposed to fail-safe design. But bend is also in people's lives. I met this guy named Billy Parrish covering a climate talks in Montreal in 2005. And he's the barefoot one. And he was great at it. He helped to form this organization called Energy Action. It was one of the first campus organizations on climate and energy. And he was really good at that. But then he kind of felt a new phase was needed. And more recently, yes, he's kind of wearing a suit and growing up. But he's created this company called Mosaic that's a new financial model for pulling together the capital so that low-income housing development can get solar panels on its roof, that kind of thing. So he reminds me of like a salmon swimming upstream. There's a rock here or some eddy or some impediment, and the salmon adjusts, but it keeps going upstream. And having that capacity, especially in a world where the world as we knew it is gone, where things are changing is the new norm. There isn't a new normal coming. I think that's always been true through history, but I think it's more true now. So having a capacity to be agile, to keep your eye on the prize, but to have the sense of how to, when it's time to switch to a new tactic is a good thing. Now here's a really interesting. How many of you have heard these stories about sinking islands, rising seas, island communities? Almost every story that has been written about that issue has been a woe is me story. And the refugees are coming in floods, which is sort of woe is me for them, and oh my God, they're coming. That's scary. That's like the two frames of that story. But I've talked to a scientist named Paul Kench. He's in New Zealand. I've been in touch with him, long distance. For 20 years, he's been studying actual islands. There are thousands of islands, these low atoll islands, that are very dynamically, they actually keep up with sea level rise. Even in parts of the Pacific Ocean where, because of local geology, the sea level is rising faster than the global average. This is an island that has actually grown slightly in its area in the last 100 years, in an area with very rapid sea level rise. And so you say, well, how could that be? Well, it's because it's dynamic. It's the sediment around the shores is shifting, and storm will deposit sediment here. And then I've been to this island in the Maldives. I was there in 1984 on a subsequent sailing trip. And they're on that wanderlust too, actually, in 1980. I've been there twice before I was a journalist. It didn't look like that in 1980 or in 1984. But now it's the capital island of this group of islands. Now, what can that island not do? It can't do that, right? It's been built out to the shoreline, so it has none of that capacity for dynamics. And Houston is the same. It's not an island. It's a floodplain issue. It's the same issue. If you build out to the edges, and you build in a brittle way, then you can give up on the idea of having a sort of long-term resilient strategy in a world with lots of meteorological or sea level dynamics. So that says to me that there's ways even to start conversations. What can we do for island communities around the world? Well, maybe we can work with them to see if there's a new way to think about progress that isn't like making every island like Manhattan Island, if that's not the way forward for these areas. And New York City has to think about this. I've written about this. Sea level rise is affecting any coastal area except the Great Lakes. You have other issues here, but not that one. This is a wonderful. The Wildlife Conservation Society a few years ago did this exhibition called Mannahatta, where they did a very careful ecological analysis of what Manhattan was like pre-settlement, before Henry Hudson and all that stuff. And so you could actually go to your neighborhood and realize what was there ecologically before you were there. And what is yet to come is, fill in this blank. What is a way to design? How do you think about New York City for the next 200 years in a world where we know sea levels are rising at a rate that will make today's shorelines history? That's an interesting design challenge, and it's not just a architecture challenge. It is social. How do you design the politics for that? It's an interesting question. And then stretch. So Ben, stretch. Stretch is like thinking ahead and finding a new way to think about old issues. In the Hudson Valley, the Scenic Hudson is a conservation group there. They do open land conservation. I'm sure there's land conservancies here where they're now talking to landowners along the Hudson River. Today's estuaries, like that marshy area, that's going to be a bay 100 years from now because sea level will be higher. That part of the Hudson River is an arm of the sea. It's part of the sea. So sea level rises. They know that that's not going to be a marsh anymore, so birds won't be there. So they're actually negotiating with landowners about easements of the future in areas that are not yet marshy, but that will be marshy 50 or 100 years from now. It's a new way to think about conservation strategies. Stretch is also business models. Taylor guitar. I'm a guitar player. You'll hear me in a minute if we have time. I'm sorry if I'm running a little long. Taylor, they realized that ebony, that beautiful wood, the black wood in a violin or a cello, the fingerboards and stuff was getting rare and coming from Madagascar where terrible trade in illegal lumber. But he realized that in other parts of Africa, there's still plenty of ebony, but it's not like beautifully, perfectly black. So it looks more like that. So what Taylor is trying to do is change his customers. He's not just working on the wood end, but he's actually trying to encourage guitar players to think, well, why does your fingerboard actually have to be black? And when Nike can do that too, then we know we're in a world where we might have some different outcomes. I heard a talk by a Nike sustainability guy a year ago in Washington, D.C., and I asked him this. I brought up this example. I said, is Nike doing that? How much are you educating your customers about sustainability? And he said, oh, they do these product tests, all the time with test groups and stuff. And he said when they have the word sustainability on the package, people see it as a negative. They're less likely to buy it or to like it because they think there was a compromise. So that says to me there's some work to be done there. There's opportunities there. I'm not quite sure how that plays out. I am going to speed up. So Ben Stretch Reach is, well, to me, a big chunk of that's communication. Even though journalism has limits, as I said to you, I suddenly realized, I could write great stories about global warming for the rest of my life, but it's not going to be the thing that changes people. But the communication and the way we do it, the way you think about it going forward, I think does have potential to really change things. This was in India, where they're so limited. There are 100 million farming families in India. And if you're the extension agent, how do you deal with that? There's some better seed variety or whatever. So they're using YouTube and social media to help farmers understand better ways to plant, and that's exciting. Twitter, I think, can be your friend. Not always. It's also been President Trump's friend in ways that some people find troubling. But there's ways to build networks across distance and time that were not there before. And this, I want to circle back one more time to the behavioral literature. I told you earlier, all this science says, well, basically we're all in our little bubbles and we're not going to get out of them for the sake of reality, facts. But there are ways to use that same data to understand there are opportunities out there. A couple of years ago, this team at Yale did a national survey of attitudes on global warming and on energy and stuff. And this is percent of adults who are worried about global warming in 2014. And you can see it's pretty varied, but it's all pastel colors, right? Everyone's worried about something else. We worry about the economy or healthcare. This is an issue that is a pastel issue for most people. So that says, oh, that's not encouraging. Here's percentage of adults who support regulating CO2 as a pollutant. And actually, I thought we were dividing, where's the red state, blue state thing? I don't see it there. In other words, people have a common sense that pollution, that a gas that has negative ramifications for the environment is something that's worth regulating. And then this one, percentage of adults who support funding research into renewable energy sources, 2014. It's even more rosy, more concordance. Basically, there's no division over that. And that says to me there's ways forward. The conversation for that is not about global warming. It's about energy and smart energy choices. So teaching, bend, stretch, reach, teach. I did teach for the last 6 years, and it can matter. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't matter. One of the most exciting things I've seen, a teaching example, was here in the Bronx. There's a school, it's the High School of Energy and Technology. It's one of those specialized schools. And the students go on a tour. They go to the boiler room in their school. And they learn about their school as a system. And the custodian was the lecturer for the day. He tells them how much oil they burn. And that 20 years ago, they were actually heating that school with coal. Most of New York City schools were heated with coal right up until 20 years ago. It's amazing. So they're learning, systems thinking is, everyone talks about it, and here there's a way to do it. If you just think about a school in a new way, it's not just classrooms and teachers, it's a structure and it's a system, and how does that work? And making that part of how you learn can be a really rich pathway forward, I think. At Pace University, we did films about, it could have been, the documentary course I did could have been about anything. It turned out all the 6 films that we worked on the 6 years I was there were on sustainability themes, and the students got to tell stories that really mattered. And the one we did in Curacao on coral reef conservation in the Caribbean got shown on national TV in Curacao. And that felt to me like a great accomplishment. So there's ways forward. Bend, stretch, reach, teach. Reveal is, in so many ways, a powerful tool going forward. Sometimes it's very simple. Like, if you want to have a conversation about fracking, or about restricting emissions of gases that are harmful, that are invisible, then I recommend using infrared photography. This is a beautiful sunny day at a Colorado oil and gas facility. And this is the same facility, hold on, there. That's the same place, just with an infrared camera. So, and these are volatile compounds, including methane, which contribute to smog and also greenhouse gas. So not thinking, that was when you might have tracked it in LA, there was that big fountain of natural gas a year, maybe it was 2 years ago already. That would not have been a news story if it hadn't been shown in infrared photography. So sometimes it's that simple. There's great potential now for corporate transparency to be increased, and it can come from externally or internally. VW is a great example of external transparency, where it was just this really low budget thing. West Virginia University and got a grant from a auto pollution nonprofit, tiny grant to test some cars. And they tested these cars, and it turned out that the computer reading from the car's computer was way off. And at first they thought their instruments were wrong, then they realized the car computers were cheating. And that's how the whole VW thing unraveled. There's great capacity now for that. You don't need a lot of money, you just need to have the motivation to look. And so that's a great force, I think, for a positive force, transparency. Reflect is pausing and thinking once in a while. How are we doing? Science, getting the sciences to think and to talk to each other is another part of that. I've written about this institute in Colorado where scientists fighting over disciplinary questions go there to hash out their problems. And they go on hikes because when you're at 6,000 feet altitude, you can't argue. I thought that's a great, you're too out of breath to argue. So these seismologists are arguing about earthquake science, and they find a way to work it out. Response diversity. This gets back to this, there is no we. I was in long fights sometimes with people about strategies, environmental strategies, when I was writing .earth, that seemed to me as if they weren't productive and seemed to other people like they were. And I started thinking, well, how can you have an environmental movement where people have the same goal but different paths can actually get along? This relates to nuclear power and fracking and lots of issues where people have a common goal but who just seem to spend most of their energy fighting with each other instead of actually pursuing progress. And there's this paper I stumbled on that's about ecological resilience comes through when an ecosystem has diverse responses to a reaction to something happening in the environment, it's more resilient. It's not the diversity of species in an ecosystem. It's the diversity of responses to a stress that make it more resilient. And that thing's, to me, carrying that forward to society seems like a valuable thing to do. So, and I'm going to end at the Vatican, where I kind of began at the beginning. This meeting of the Vatican was remarkable. There's been a Pontifical Academy of Sciences and a Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences for a long time. And so there's been crossover with the science community for a long time there. But more increasingly, they've been focused on issues related to sustainability. In 2014, there was this meeting called, it was Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Nature, Our Responsibility. That was the framing title of the meeting. It was a week. I was really privileged to be among the people who were there for a week. And there were the Nobel Prize winning scientists and sociologists and clergy, and the Pope popped by. This is like my Where's Waldo moment. So there's the Pope. There's a Nobel Prize winner. Walter Munk, who I'll tell you about in a minute, is the guy with the walker. He's turning 100 next month. He's one of the great oceanographers in the history of oceanography. He helped, among other things, win World War II by coming up with a forecast for wave heights on beaches ahead of beach landings. And I'll get back to him. There's me over on the right. So, but what was really interesting was there were all these lectures about economics and about physics, and Martin Rees, the Royal Astronomer of England, gave this existential threats lecture that was really scary. But in the end, it was this, the values and data were all mashed up in there in a way that's really was a great model for how to think about these issues going forward. The data only frame the story. They don't tell you where to go. I've learned that over and over again. So I think it's valuable not to presume that science is going to be the thing that answers these questions. Science just delineates the boundaries of the question, but we have to hash out what you do with that. And I was sitting there with Walter Munk, he was then 96, after dinner in this unbelievable 500-year-old marble room. And I said to him, so Walter, so what happens next? I said, so what's your view of what will get us through this century? And he's a physical oceanographer, so he's very much a numbers guy, right? And he paused for a couple of seconds and he said, it'll take a miracle of love and unselfishness. It had nothing to do with science. I thought he was going to say something about geoengineering or nuclear power or we need more money for whatever. But it was about those things. That's the fabric between the numbers is those things. And if you write down that URL over there, or just get in touch with me later, I can tell you. I wrote a lot about this issue at that time. So that's where we are. Oh, rejoice. That's the last one. That bend, stretch, reach, teach, reflect, reveal, rejoice is in there. And that's, getting out into that world outside rooms like this, making it part of your day, making sure young people have access to getting muddy or dirty like those kids at that nature museum is a big part of going forward too. Oh, and the last one was repeat. This is the hard one, discipline. It's the hardest one for me. I'm really bad at exercise and all that stuff. Bill McKibben, Bill McKibben's rhetoric, he and I have known each other through all this time. And he's, the book that he wrote that's least read is the one he wrote in the year he spent trying to learn how to be a long-distance skier. His dad was suffering through a bad illness, and he did. And so his language is all about urgency. It's all about now, war. But I encourage people to look at his life track, which is like Billy Parrish. It's about moving forward, finding a new way to do something. If it's not working, it's about endurance and not presuming this is a problem to fix. The sooner we get over the idea that something like global warming is a problem to fix, I think the better we'll be. It's an issue to address in a resilient, forward-looking, sustained way. It's the only way that actually embraces the shape of the problem itself. And we have these futures ahead of us. I keep thinking about like lit match versus LED. Anyone here know the slow-mo guys? One of the students must. It's a YouTube channel, this guy Gavin Free, and they do goofy things like burning 6,000 match heads. And so our choice, you can look at us right now like the bacteria and think of us as like a flaming match. We got this fossil fuel and we're powerful and bright, burning bright, but is it going to be an enduring glow, or is it a flame, brief flame? That's still totally an open question going forward. And that's a question I hope we can all explore going forward as well.
How confident
I'll end with this guy.
For the sake of a future planet?
I'll tell you who he is in a minute.
They're mostly for our forebears, our successors.
This is the sort of thing that I have hopes for, but I wouldn't even venture a prediction. This is humanity's final exam, and just like you don't really know how well the students will do on the questions until you get the exams back, I don't think we'll really have the answer for 100 years. I certainly know that there's enough goodness and enough innovative potential in humanity to solve this problem, and the consequences of not doing it right are bigger than I think any other thing that humanity has faced. So I'll just say I have hope, but I wouldn't have a prediction. I know we can do this, but I just have no way of assessing whether we will.
He's a really smart climate scientist at Oxford. He's the Halley Professor of Physics at Oxford now. He was at the University of Chicago for a long time. So I love the way he framed that. And that's our challenge going forward, is the exam is on. Thank you. Did I go too long? I do have, you can leave if you need to. There's no reason to stay. But I'm going to end with one other thing. So I wrote a song going forward. It's a 3-minute history of fossil fuels. Took 1,000 generations for our species to rise, but gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. Then someone came along and said, hey, try lighting this. He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. Said, come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe. It's the American way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my TV. BP's black label burns in my SUV. We can light up the planet like a Christmas tree. They say that things are getting hot, but hey, we've got AC. That's adaptation. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe. It's the human way. Pump those electrons and that gasoline. No sweat or hurry, just turn on a machine. We send an army to the desert to keep this country free. Hey, hey, and to liberate some carbon, baby, for you and me. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll lift your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come Avoid some carbon, babe, it's the human way. I think I won't off you long. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.